One day, while we were living in the southeast end of town, I looked up on the hillside and saw a cloud of dust and heard the jingle of spurs. It was some of Pancho Villa's men coming. The men came right into our yard and to the barn in the back and started a campfire. The children and I were alone. John was up in the mountains. I locked the doors and closed the curtains, but as I peeked through a curtain, a face was there trying to look in. I had cooked a large pot of beans that day and was just taking bread out of the oven. I took some out to the men, who were delighted to get the food. They never bothered us. They left at dawn. The first house I remember living in was the brick home of my grandfather Clough. I was my mother's baby tender. I was born in Pima, Arizona, June the 7th, 1891. I was the fourth of 13 children. My father, Heber Manasseh Clough, and my mother, Sarah Ann Weech, had lived in Pima since their childhood. I was 6.5 years old when my family left for Mexico in January 1898. We traveled by team and wagon. When we children grew tired of riding, we walked or ran along by the wagons. When we stopped for lunch, we children found a sand bed and began to play. I hid a little chain in the sand. Then we would try to find it, each time with success, until one time I told the other children I was going to hide it good. And I did all right, for the chain could not be found in spite of our efforts to recover it. After I exhausted all my power, I went away from the others and knelt in prayer to ask Father in heaven to help me find my chain. I earnestly prayed that he would help me find my prized possession. Arising, I went back to continue my search. My prayer was answered, for soon the chain was found, and I was a happy child. This was the beginning of a lifelong belief of faith, and I have had my prayers answered many times since.
On March 26, 1898, the Clough family arrived in Colonia Garcia, Mexico, a Mormon colony nestled within the Sierra Madre Mountains.
When we first arrived, I thought it was the ugliest place in the world. It was dry, and the winds were a-blowin', and the crops hadn't come up yet, and I thought, well, that's a sad old place to have to live in. Father was anxious to get a home built. He bought a whole block, partly covered with timber. Father brought apple trees with him to Mexico, so as soon as possible, the land was cleared and the trees planted. 4 months later, we moved into our new house. There was no glass in the windows, but we had a good roof. I helped my father in the fields during spring planting and fall harvesting. During the summer months, I pulled and hoed weeds, choking the crops. Daddy said I was his right-hand man on the farm. I had to help cut the corn, and we would race to see who could get through the rows first. The warm, sunny days were very scarce in Garcia. Many times I waded to school in snow, mud, slush, and water up to my knees. We didn't have beautiful, comfortable schoolhouses. Our schools were frame buildings, used as churches and school, and very cold. We had to sit all day with cold, wet feet. The young people always had good times dancing, having parties, and going on outings. I recall one outing in particular. I was accompanied by a fine young man who grew up just across the street from me, John Bingham by name, the only son of Brigham Heber Bingham, the carpenter. We began to see more of each other. Time came when my crowd began to marry. In March 1910, the bug bit me. As John and I had become engaged, I was counted as one of his family. They bought a beautiful white silk dress trimmed with lace for me. Father always taught us to be married in the temple, and that required means to go to Salt Lake City, which trip had to be made by train.
John's father sold almost all his cattle to get means to take John and Pearl to the temple to be married. They were married the 13th of April, 1910 in the Salt Lake Temple. John's parents, Brigham and Mary, were able to attend the ceremony. Upon returning home to Garcia, John and Pearl lived in a little log cabin with many cherry trees out in front. On July 2nd, 1911, their first child, Elva, was born. When Elva was 13 months old, the people of Mexico were driven from their homes by Pancho Villa and his men. They had 24 hours to move out, taking nothing but a change of clothing. They abandoned their homes, gardens, and left most of their belongings. Pearl and John took a train to Pima, Arizona to stay with Pearl's mother. After a short time, they relocated to Binghamton, near Tucson.
We lived in a 2-room adobe house when on the first day of April 1913, a wee baby girl, Levita, came to our home. I had no doctor. It was her Grandma Bingham who cared for me.
A couple of years later, on July 19, 1915, a pair of twin boys were born. Elmer and Emer were both 8 pounds. Sadly, Elmer only lived a few hours. The next summer, in 1916, John became homesick and wanted to move his family back to Mexico. Although the Mexican Revolution wasn't over, they felt it was safe enough to return. However, they relocated to a safer colony, Colonia Juarez.
It was in August, a long, hot, hard trip. Mosquitoes ate at us at night. We located at Juarez. It was still not safe for us to return to our homes in the mountains.
In October of 1917, a 10-pound boy, Van, was born. The very next month, John and Pearl were finally able to move their family back home to Colonia Garcia. Unfortunately, many homes in Garcia had been pillaged and damaged by the soldiers of the Revolution.
We found our home had been burned, so we lived in a 2-room brick house. The kitchen floor was gone, and there was no glass in the windows. We lived in one room with 4 children, and the rats were thick.
Over the next 10 years, 6 more children were born to Pearl and John while living in Garcia. They were all about 2 years apart in age. Dot, a stillborn baby girl, Garth, Zova, Ivina, Levon, also known as Tawny, and their 10th and last child, Mary Lou, was born in 1928. In May of 1929, John and Pearl left Mexico and moved their family to Bisbee, Arizona to give their children better educations. John found work in the mines, but he didn't like it. He soon left his family and went back to Mexico. Their oldest daughter, Elva, recalled,
"Mother chose to stay in Bisbee, for there were better schools and living conditions there. Dad stayed away, and he let another woman talk him into marrying her. She also left her family, a husband and 4 children."
My husband got up and left us there in Bisbee to starve without a penny and $30 rent due, with 9 mouths to feed, no home or support. We were penniless, alone and forsaken for another, not worthy of the steps he took to leave us. I was robbed of my happiness, and I always hope that others will find the joy that was denied me early in married life. Only 19 years with a husband, the father of my children, who left us stranded and alone. I was true to my husband and went through poverty, the worst kind, but that did not take my love from him. Nothing mattered but the fact that he was untrue to me, and it was his choice to stay with me or leave, and leave he did. I married him for time and for eternity, but he made it impossible.
It was 1931, and in the thick of the Great Depression. Pearl took any work she could find to provide for her family. She washed and ironed laundry for neighbors, cleaned homes and businesses, and made beds at a boarding house. Her oldest daughters, Elva and Levita, went to work in their teens, working as maids in rich homes, which helped pay their monthly rent.
Mom always took care to see that we were fed and clothed, even if she had to go without at times. She would make us clothes out of flour sacks and dye them in colors. She had to bake bread every day and make 9 lunches, and she milked our cow.
We lived out of town, and I had to walk to Relief Society many times alone over a hilly and lonely road at night. Wherever we go or live, we find good people who take us to and from church.
When Pearl's sons, Emer, Van, and Garth, began to work, they were more well off and could even buy a 2-seated Ford to ride in to and from church. Her daughter Ivina remembers,
"In Bisbee, we lived in 4 different houses. Then Mom said she was tired of being kicked out of every house, so she bought one in South Bisbee. It was good to finally have a place of our own."
After living in Bisbee for 9 years, Pearl decided to move the remainder of her family to Mesa, Arizona in the summer of 1938 so that they could be closer to the Mesa Temple. That very year, Pearl was introduced to a man named Raleigh Mathena. They both had a love for genealogy and temple work and soon were married in the Mesa, Arizona Temple, November of 1938. After 9 years of marriage, Raleigh lost his job. Pearl took on the role of provider for the rest of their marriage. She worked in the Mesa Temple, cleaning, doing the laundry, and serving in the cafeteria. In 1954, Pearl wrote,
I have been under great mental strain and beside myself with anxiety because I sense so strongly my responsibility as breadwinner. My husband hasn't worked since 1947 when he was laid off. Now in the sunset of my life, I want so much to keep on working till the last breath. That's the only way I can be happy. When I have a job assigned me, I take hold and shoulder the responsibility. My motto is, do or bust, do or die.
After 22 years of marriage, Pearl had all she could take and was ready for a divorce from Raleigh.
While I am tied down to work, Raleigh is at leisure any time to go and do as he pleases. I was working so hard to keep all the bills paid and the housework going, while he sat at home taking care of himself. I tried to hold out to the end, but find I can't.
After their divorce, Pearl retired in 1962 at the age of 71. She had worked in the temple for 12 years. Pearl felt she needed to get out of the Mesa summer heat and move to someplace cooler. She decided to move to the mountains in Pine, Arizona. Soon, she bought a mobile home. Pearl made many dear friends in Pine. She was always doing something kind and thoughtful for others. She spent most of her time writing letters to family and loved ones, and making quilts for her children and grandchildren.
She was a wonderful mother to us. She taught us all about the gospel and read the Book of Mormon to us as small children. Mother always bore her testimony of the truthfulness of the gospel, and that instilled it in me to this day.
Mom was the most staunch, church-going person. Her every waking hour was spent doing things with church. Meetings, Relief Society events, and singing in the ward choir. She always encouraged us to do what is right. And I want to say that without a husband and father all those years, we all turned out good, decent, law-abiding, church-going people. I marvel at how she was able to accomplish this alone. She was a wonderful example to all of us.
Now, in the case of me forgiving John Bingham of what he did to me and to my family, surely put me to the test. And I say to anyone who has aught against his brother, sister, or neighbor, not to allow it to go on and on for years. Settle it as soon as possible. He never did ask me to forgive him. However, I have forgiven him. I love all my children very dearly and wish them much joy. I know the greatest joy comes through service. I have always taken pleasure in what I did for them and ask nothing in return except that they carry on in the church as I know God would have them do. I have a strong testimony. It is my most worthy possession. That and my membership in the church. Life would not be worth living if it were not for the knowledge I have of the true and everlasting gospel of Jesus Christ.